Hi, I'm Nina Cooke John, founder of Studio Cooke John, and you're watching A Student's Perspective.
Okay, great. Hi, I am Katie, and you're watching A Student's Perspective. Today I'm speaking with Nina Cooke John, founder of Studio Cooke John. If you like our conversation today, like, share, and comment any questions you may have. So thank you, Nina, for speaking with me today. I'm very excited for our conversation. Would you like to start out by introducing yourself and giving us a little about yourself and your background?
I'm Nina Cooke John, founder of Studio Cooke John, which is a small multidisciplinary firm based in New York, but I work in the tri-state area and across the country. My firm does a mix of residential, commercial, public art, public engagement work. I also teach at Columbia University and Parsons School of Design. I've been practicing architecture for about, oh my goodness, about 25 years now. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me.
Okay. Would you like to describe your schooling when maybe or how about we start with how did you become interested in architecture and what made you want to be an architect?
Yeah, it's hard for me to pinpoint exactly when I decided to become an architect because actually for most of my high school years, I was going to be a doctor. So I was in the science track. I grew up in Kingston, Jamaica. And back then, I feel like you were either going to be a lawyer or a doctor if you did well in school. And in my last year of high school, I decided to take classes at the School of Art. And I just went there in the evenings. I did painting class, ceramics class. And I can't remember. I don't think I met an architect. Maybe I walked into someone's beautiful home or something. And I decided I wanted to become an architect. At that time, there was no architecture program in Jamaica or the Caribbean. So you either had to go to the States or to England to study. And I already had family in New York. So when I first came, I was at City College in New York. I lived in the Bronx with my uncle. And then one of my professors there encouraged me and another friend of mine to transfer. And so we transferred to Cornell. And Cornell is where I had the bulk of my undergraduate education, which I totally loved. It was a very different setting compared to, living in an apartment and commuting to school. Where I also had a great experience at City College, but then being able to be totally immersed in the studio environment at Cornell was really different because at City College, he didn't have dedicated desk space. So even though, I had a tight knit group of friends that, we would sleep under the desk and shower in the gym. So we didn't have to take the train late at night. It was great to really be able to have, an immersive studio experience where everyone had their own space and we were living the campus life, which is totally like, it's like extended camp life, really.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. So after studying at Cornell, what was your plan coming straight out of college? Did you have one or?
I don't know that I had a real plan. And, again, I graduated from undergrad in 95. So there was no like searching for um, firms online. Went to the library, looked at some magazines, found some cool firms that I liked. And my first firm that I worked at, I think I was relatively lucky in that there were only about 5 or 6 of us at the time. So in 95, we were coming out of a recession. So that office had been like 20, 25 people before and had downsized during that recession and were just like growing, but they had great projects. So, they were working on projects for NYU. They were my first project working with them was for a synagogue up in Riverdale. They were also working on like really big houses across the country. So they had a really great mix of work. But because it was a relatively small firm, I got to do, a lot of great things. So not only did I work on the model for that synagogue, doing roof studies, building the entire model, but I also worked on the construction drawings for that synagogue. So I really got to see it all the way through, but I also worked on, the other projects in the office. Um, and so it was a very kind of nurturing environment. And I was there for 2 years, but I knew I wanted to teach at some point. So even though I got a BArch degree and really I didn't need to go on to get another degree, I decided to go to graduate school. So after working there for 2 years, I went to Columbia for my graduate degree.
Okay, that was my next question was how did you know you wanted to teach in like and when reading a little bit about you, you said like you kind of immersed yourself back into like student life even while teaching. So I would like I guess my question would be like how did um, teaching like change your perspective when coming back into to the field afterwards?
Yeah, the reason I wanted to teach was that there are a lot of really theoretical ideas that I wanted to still be engaged with, in addition to wanting to build, right? The kind of really practical side. So, while I was teaching, I was teaching studio, but I was also teaching a seminar that looked at how subcultures appropriate space in cities, which was directly related to my own undergraduate thesis, which looked at like essentially capturing leftover spaces in the Bronx and Brooklyn and converting them, was called the urban porch, and converting them to programmatic space for the immigrant community in those two areas where they could, it became like small scale community centers in a way, right? But it was taking over spaces that people weren't using, and then kind of converting that same, ideology in terms of students to explore the same issues, but looking at different subcultures. Like I had one student who was looking at the rave culture in London and, like how they operated. And so once I wasn't teaching full time anymore, and really kind of engaging in the craft of building, that because I was still teaching part time, I could still have that part of my brain active, right? The one that was looking for innovative ways that architecture could really affect, the built environment and urban engagement.
Oh, very cool. So after teaching, did Studio Cooke John come to be right after, or was it a process right after teaching? Or I guess how did Studio Cooke John come to be?
So when I was teaching full time, I had a tenure track position at Syracuse, but I was still living in New York City. And I had an infant at the time. And so I was driving up at the beginning of the week and spending the week there and then coming back. So I was essentially commuting with an infant. And that was just a lot of work. And then by the time, my second child came around, I definitely couldn't do that anymore. So once I was back in the city full time and working part time, then I really was just freelancing. So I was freelancing with a friend of mine who was doing a lot of high-end residential work as well as some commercial work. Offices for lawyers and hedge fund offices, things like that. So I was working with her for a really long time, but kind of on a basis where, because I was parenting and teaching, it would be as many hours as I could really manage. And having had at the bigger firms that I worked at, because before teaching full time, I was at Polshek Partnership, which is now INEAD. And there I worked on really big institutional projects, and there were like 100 people at the firm at that time. So I went from working on those big institutional projects to working on, an intimate scale in terms of these houses and commercial spaces. So I, gained a lot of on the ground knowledge in terms of really the detailing and material use. And so then eventually, after doing that for a while, I decided to start my own firm, which would give me even more flexibility because, I had gotten to a stage, I think I did freelancing for quite a while before I then started my own company, which then really was a matter of just having full control over my time ultimately as a parent. And having had the new knowledge base to be able to work in that environment on my own.
Oh yeah, it sounds like it definitely was. You were definitely doing everything, which is so cool. So you said that you went from working at like a huge firm to a really intimate one. Could you tell us the difference between working at a large scale versus a small scale?
So what's either good or bad is that when you're working at a really big firm, you're usually working on the one project, and the one portion of the project, there's a team and you have a role, and it's usually pretty clearly defined, and you can get like really deep in the one project in that one role that you're working in. When you're in a small office, you're doing everything, right? And likely on multiple projects. So you're doing everything from, not only in the design process, but also in the project management process, and really, working with contractors one-on-one, working on the job site one-on-one, engaging with clients. Client engagement is really, really important, right? As well as working on things like the marketing side of the company. What do you need to develop in terms of being on site for photo shoots for finished projects, as well as developing them. So in a small firm, you're definitely working across the spectrum. And it's also, you have to be really fluid, because again, if you're working with, someone's office or someone's home, it's much more service oriented. So you kind of have to respond to things a lot more quickly, whether it's responding to something on the job site or responding to, anything else that might be part of the process. It's oftentimes you might have to stop what you're doing on one thing and switch gears really quickly, which in a small firm that's working on a really big institutional process, the timeline is much longer. I didn't find it nearly as intense in terms of what might be happening day to day.
Oh, okay. So since Studio Cooke John is a more intimate setting, I saw that you wanted to focus on high impact residential design and design for international cultural institutions. Could you describe that focus for me, and what made you want to focus on that specifically?
So we're actually doing a lot more public engagement work now. So, and what that allows me to do is take all the craft work that's involved in high-end residential work that's high impact, meaning that it's really about understanding the client really well, listening really carefully so that you're creating spaces that are uniquely tailored to their needs. And each project is going to be really different. So it becomes high impact in that it really affects their day-to-day living in an impactful way. And it involves an attention to craft and detailing of the materials that you're using, how those are placed in a residential setting, really intimate. Then when it comes to the kind of public engagement work that I've been doing recently, especially public art, it's kind of translating the intimate scale, the materials, the detailing to the public setting. So people can still enjoy it in their day-to-day lives, but on the street, right? As they're walking to work, as they're going to the grocery store. And then those kind of come together in cultural institutions, small scale cultural institutions, which are kind of semi-private, right? Because very often you have more engagement with the public. People are dropping in, you know, whether it's a museum or some other cultural institution. Um, but oftentimes there's the intimacy of a residential scale, depending on the size of it. So I see it as a spectrum, really, that is still about really understanding how the space is going to be used, who is going to use it, what the needs are day to day versus special occasions, and how we can respond to those in a really thoughtful way.
Do you have like a favorite project in mind, or um, one that kind of sticks out in your head?
Well, in terms of residential work, there's one project that was a loft in Chelsea that was great because the clients were great. They were very open to out of the box ideas, and they trusted us to kind of materialize our vision, right? And the challenge was each project has its own challenge. And this challenge was that it was really long site. And so there was light coming in from windows at either end, but we needed to program the middle. And how do we create kind of an additional space in the middle while still allowing natural light to get in and still allowing you to kind of access it? So we put essentially a cube in the middle of the space, and one in which, you know, the ceilings were lower and we put a skylight at the top. So when you're in the space, whether you're in as a guest and the doors are closed, you could still get natural light coming in from above. Or if you're using it as an office, you can open, you know, the two giant sliding doors on either side, and it becomes this really open, flexible move through space. So we found it to be really successful on multiple levels while designing it, and have been really delighted to hear from the client even years later how well it's working in different ways, you know, because of how flexible it is.
Yeah, it definitely. Yeah, flexibility was definitely like super important. And like you said, it's been working great. So that's really cool. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Um, so so we recently interviewed Julia from Madam Architect. Could you or we see now that you're working with Madam Architect. So how did that develop, and what kind of work are you guys doing?
Yeah, you know, Julia and I just met randomly, like in an elevator going up to a meeting that we were both going to be at. We were both members of the Wing, which was essentially a space in Manhattan where you could work and socialize as women. Um, and, you know, after that, you know, she asked if she could interview me. And so since the interview, we've been in touch on different levels, and she's invited me to be on the advisory board. So just talking about the direction that Madam Architect is going in, and how best to bring that about. But also I was invited to do a column. So a column that really talks about kind of life in the city, but from my perspective. And, it's called kind of the limitless city in terms of really all the possibilities that the city allows, but where there might be limits for people of kind of different backgrounds or different needs in the city. So that's, I'm really happy to be working with Madam Architect because it's a great blog.
Yeah, it seems like fate that you guys met in the elevator. I think that's a really interesting story.
Yeah.
So I guess with the pandemic, how have things changed for you in your studio? Like what kind of challenges do you guys have more recently, I guess?
Yeah, so everything slowing down was a bit of a challenge. A lot of projects kind of went on hold, and then those that went on hold are suddenly all want to come back at the same time. So that's challenging just in terms of workflow. I have been lucky enough to have done a couple projects during the pandemic. One of them was an installation project that went in Flatiron Plazas in November of last year and was there through January and has since moved. So once it came down, it went to Montclair, New Jersey, and it's now in Wasake, New York. But it was commissioned during the pandemic. And a big part of the idea was understanding how we could connect to each other not only while being socially distant, but the idea that New Yorkers oftentimes are not connected to each other, so we don't understand the different social issues that affect us all. So it feels like, we're blindsided when, suddenly we hear that. Because, during the pandemic, there are a lot of issues that came to light to people who had no idea, right? Not until kids weren't going to school anymore did everyone else realize how many students are dependent on school for lunch and breakfast, frankly. So if we kind of were more connected to each other, maybe we would know the issues that affect others that don't necessarily affect us. So that was a project that got the commission in July, went in November, and that was really all pandemic oriented. And then there was another project that started during the pandemic, which was the Obsidian Concept House that I worked on with the Black Architects and Designers Guild, which was a completely kind of utopian virtual house that I was one of the architects for, and it just created space for the interior designers whose show houses were getting closed down during the pandemic. They couldn't kind of showcase their work. And so we created this virtual space that was rendered in high def. We worked many months on it, and we created this really amazing interactive experience. So there have been some great things that actually have come out of it. I think it was a matter of just thinking really differently, things that I wouldn't have been able to have done without the lockdown because I would have been too busy. So I think it's been actually a net positive just because of the difference.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned you have some like installations in like out in the street. Could you talk about those more? Or yeah, I've seen pictures and I would just like to know more about them, I guess.
Yeah, so the installation project that was at the Flatiron Plazas were both in the North and South Plaza. They went in just before Thanksgiving, and they were made of bent aluminum and rope, 9 different sculptures that were grouped into pods of 3, and they became these thresholds that you could enter, and the light would kind of spotlight you so that you can be seen, within a city of 8 million people, but also so that you could take a time within the threshold, the physical threshold of the piece, but also the threshold of the pandemic to kind of contemplate where we were. And then on the ground of the plazas were the 6-foot circles that kind of anchored the sculptures. and radiating out from each of them were these concentric circles that would overlap and kind of symbolize a larger connection, even though we were socially distanced. So I was really, especially in the city location, just delighted to see how different people interacted with them, you know, whether as they were just walking by, they stopped and looked and walked through, or people who just sat for like 2 minutes and then went on, or, you know, people who posted on Instagram like a skateboarder skating through it. So the great thing about installation projects that are in the street is that it's totally belongs to the public now, and they will engage with it and interact with it however they want to, which I think is great.
Yeah, I think they really give like a part in it because as an architect, you know how you would interact, but to see how other people, I think, is definitely interesting.
Yeah.
So, what advice would you give your student self if you could?
You know, and I say this often to my own students too, because I've learned that now, but you learn and you gain amazing skills at every stop along your path, regardless of how circuitous it might be. You know, at every one of the institutions I've worked at, whether architectural institutions or educational institutions, I have gained amazing knowledge that really I use every day. You know, the things I learned at that really big firm, just in terms of engaging with clients at a certain level, in terms of structuring, you know, the really kind of fastidious, just laying out drawings in a certain way, writing meeting minutes in a certain way, the things that I learned at the smaller firm, like how to kind of always be on my toes and being ready to adjust, whether design or in the construction world. And sometimes when you're in it, you're hating it and you're like, oh my God, I cannot, you know, draw another brick on this building. But sometimes you have to step back and think about the larger picture, and all of those skills are transferable and you can definitely use it again. Even if when you're in school, you're working at Starbucks, like, you know, there are just interpersonal skills that you're learning and you're gaining that you're going to use in a different way later on.
So, for our viewers watching, how could they find you and follow up on what you are doing day to day?
So on Instagram, I'm at Studio Cooke John or at Nina Cooke John. And my website is cookejohn.com. And that's Cook with an E and John like the man's name.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so thank you so much, Nina, for speaking with us today. We really had a great time with you on A Student's Perspective. And if you liked our conversation today, it will continue next week. So stay tuned for the next episode of A Student's Perspective. Thank you.